Ethan Collins sat slumped at the corner of a rundown bar, staring at his empty glass with bloodshot eyes. Outside, the rain battered against the window, the neon lights flickering like distant mocking laughter. His life was in shambles. Divorced, jobless, and drowning in debt, he felt like he was suffocating under the weight of his failures. The world had turned its back on him, and he was dangerously close to ending it all. That night, as Ethan trudged through the rain-soaked streets toward his dilapidated apartment, he took a shortcut through an alley. His head pounded with thoughts of desperation, and his steps grew sluggish as the rain drenched him to the bone. Then, something strange caught his eye. Nestled between two abandoned buildings, a shop appeared, faintly illuminated by a single flickering bulb above its doorway. The sign read, "Wishes Granted." He had walked down this alley hundreds of times before and had never seen this shop. Something cold settled in his stomach, a feeling that he should turn away, but his curiosity and despair drove him forward. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense and decay. Trinkets and ancient artifacts lined the dusty shelves. A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of an unseen clock. Behind the counter sat a man in a dark suit, his face pale and angular, his eyes the color of smoldering embers. He watched Ethan with an unsettling stillness, his lips curled into a faint smile. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Lost, are we?" the man asked, his voice smooth and cold as ice. Ethan blinked, trying to find his words. The man's gaze felt like a weight pressing on his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. I don't know what I'm doing here," Ethan stammered. The man tilted his head, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "You're here because you have nowhere else to go, because you want to change your fate." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. The man was right. His life was a wreck, a downward spiral of misery. In a surge of emotion, he poured out his woes, describing his lost job, his broken marriage, his mounting debts. The man listened, expressionless, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. When Ethan finally finished, the man's lips stretched into a wider smile. "I can offer you a way out. 3 wishes, anything you desire." Ethan narrowed his eyes, a flicker of skepticism breaking through his despair. "What's the catch?" The man laughed, a sound like the grinding of stone. "There is always a price, of course, but the wishes, they are yours for the asking." He produced a parchment, its surface covered in dark, shifting symbols that made Ethan's head swim. "Sign, and you will have what you desire." Ethan stared at the parchment, his heart pounding in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to leave this place and never look back. But desperation is a powerful force. With a shaking hand, he picked up the pen and scribbled his name. The symbols flared crimson for a moment, then faded. The man's smile grew impossibly wide. "The deal is sealed." Ethan didn't know what to expect. He stumbled out of the shop, the rain now a torrent. By the time he reached his apartment, he was drenched and shivering. Collapsing onto his bed, he whispered, "I wish for wealth, enough to live without worry." He awoke the next morning to an eerie stillness. Sitting up, he glanced around his shabby apartment. Something was different. His heart skipped a beat when he noticed his phone buzzing incessantly on the bedside table. Bank alerts flashed across the screen, all of them showing deposits in staggering amounts. He rushed to his laptop and logged into his bank account. The numbers on the screen made his jaw drop. He was rich. Over the next few weeks, Ethan's life transformed. His debts were cleared, his apartment traded for a luxurious condo. He bought cars, fine clothes, and dined at expensive restaurants. The thrill of freedom was intoxicating, and for a brief moment, he felt like he was finally winning at life. But then, the strangeness began. It started with the phone calls, not from his own creditors, but from the banks and loan sharks of deceased relatives. The claims were absurd, accusing him of owing money he had never borrowed. One day, he received a letter with no return address, written in crimson ink. "What's given can be taken away." Ethan tried to ignore it, but the misfortunes escalated. The brand new car he bought was totaled in a freak accident, leaving him miraculously unscathed but shaking. The condo was broken into, valuables stolen despite the high-end security system. At night, he dreamed of drowning in a sea of gold, his mouth filling with coins as he choked and struggled for breath. The dreams left him gasping, his sheets drenched in cold sweat. As the incidents piled up, a gnawing fear settled into Ethan's bones. His wish had come true, but it had brought with it a series of curses. Yet he was too proud, too desperate to admit it. He needed a change, a distraction from his mounting paranoia. Driven by loneliness and a desire for something real, Ethan made his second wish. "I wish for love," he muttered, clutching his pillow in the dead of night. True love, the kind that can heal this emptiness. The very next day, he met Mia. She appeared as if conjured from his deepest desires. Beautiful, kind, and understanding, their romance blossomed rapidly, almost too perfect to be real. For a brief, shining moment, Ethan felt whole. But as weeks turned into months, the sinister undertones of his wish began to manifest. Mia started to change. Her skin grew pale, her eyes dull and haunted. She became frail, often bedridden with unexplained illnesses. Doctors were baffled. Every test returned normal, yet Mia wasted away before Ethan's eyes. One night, as he sat by her side, holding her cold, trembling hand, she whispered through parched lips, "I feel like something is draining my life away." A shiver ran through Ethan. In the darkened room, shadows seemed to move on their own, whispering secrets he couldn't understand. He glanced at the mirror across the room and nearly screamed. Reflected in the glass wasn't his face, but the pale, grinning visage of the man from the shop. His eyes burned with an unholy light. "What's happening to her?" Ethan cried, but the reflection only stared, the smile stretching wider. In a fit of rage and desperation, Ethan smashed the mirror. The glass shattered, scattering shards across the floor. But even as he breathed heavily, he heard a faint laugh echoing from nowhere and everywhere. Ethan's panic reached its peak. Mia was dying, and he was helpless. The guilt crushed him, threatening to smother his sanity. There was only one wish left, and he knew what he had to do. "I wish for Mia's health," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Take mine if you have to." A chilling silence settled over the room, so thick he could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. For a moment, everything was still. Then Mia gasped, her eyes snapping open, color flooding back into her cheeks. She was cured, but Ethan felt his strength leave him. A sickening wave of nausea hit him, and he collapsed to the floor, his body racked with spasms. The world blurred, twisting into a nightmare landscape where shadows reached out with clawed hands and laughter rang in his ears. Over the following weeks, Ethan withered. His skin turned sallow, his hair fell out in clumps, and his body wasted away until he was little more than skin and bones. Every breath became a laborious task, and his nights were haunted by visions of creatures lurking in the dark corners of his room, their eyes gleaming with malice. The house itself seemed to turn against him. Walls creaked as if breathing, floors groaned underfoot, and shadows danced in the periphery of his vision. Mirrors cracked without reason, and the whispers followed him everywhere. "The price must be paid," they hissed, filling his ears with an unending chant of doom. One stormy night, as lightning flashed outside, casting eerie shadows across the room, the man appeared again, sitting calmly in a chair by Ethan's bed. His presence radiated cold, seeping into Ethan's bones. "You've reaped what you sowed," the man said, his voice echoing with a chorus of inhuman tones. Ethan turned to him, his eyes sunken, filled with terror. "What do you want?" The man leaned forward, his eyes burning like twin embers in the dark. "There is one way to end this," he said softly. "You must offer something in return." Ethan's heart pounded. He knew what the man meant. "My soul," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. The man nodded, his smile sharp as a blade. "Indeed." For a long moment Ethan lay in silence, the rain pattering against the window, the wind howling outside. His mind was a tempest of fear and regret, but what choice did he have? Slowly, he nodded. "Take it. Just make it stop." The man's eyes flared, and he reached out with a skeletal hand. As his fingers touched Ethan's chest, an agony unlike any other tore through him. It felt as if his very essence was being ripped apart, dragged out piece by piece. His screams filled the room, echoing down the empty halls. When Ethan awoke, he was back in his grimy old apartment. The luxury, the wealth, all gone. The walls were damp, the air stank of mildew, and the ceiling dripped with water from a leaky roof. Mia was nowhere to be found, and he was alone once more. He stumbled to the mirror, expecting to see a hollow shell, a monster. Instead, he saw himself, haggard but whole. A cruel laugh echoed around him. Spinning around, he saw nothing, but the chill in the air told him he was not alone. "You're free," the man's voice whispered from the shadows. "But freedom comes with a price." Ethan sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. His soul was gone, and with it, any hope of peace. He was alive, but what kind of life was this? The room around him darkened, shadows pressing in, creeping closer with every breath. In the days that followed, Ethan existed in a state of numb dread. He found a menial job and tried to live a normal life, but the whispers never ceased. They clawed at the edges of his sanity, reminding him of his deal, of the darkness that now owned him. Years passed, and Ethan aged into a weary, hollow man, shuffling through life with a haunted look in his eyes. People around him sensed something was wrong, avoiding his gaze, whispering about the strange shadows that sometimes lingered near him. On his deathbed, surrounded by nothing but silence, the man appeared once more, standing at the foot of his bed. His presence filled the room with a cold that seeped into Ethan's very bones. "It's time," the man said, his voice soft and final. Ethan closed his eyes, a single tear sliding down his gaunt cheek. "Was I ever really free?" he croaked. The man's laughter filled the room, a sound of 1,000 screams. "Freedom is merely the illusion of choice, and you chose, Ethan, every single time." As the darkness closed in, Ethan felt a searing pain in his chest, and then nothing. His life ended, his soul claimed by the shadows. And somewhere in a forgotten corner of the city, a shop's door creaked open, its sign gleaming ominously in the dim light. "Wishes granted." Ethan's name faded from memory, but the shop remained, its door always open to the next desperate soul seeking an escape. For wishes are seductive, and there is always someone willing to pay the price, no matter how steep.